Hello students, let's jump into topic 2. Topic 2 has a great deal of overlap time-wise with topic 1, whereas topic 1 focused on the changes occurring in the United States during the late 19th century. Topic 2 looks at the challenges and problems that developed during the same time frame as a result of or in response to the changes occurring in the United States. We'll start this topic the same place we started topic 1, in the South. Only this time we're going to pick up at the end of Reconstruction and see what happens in the South after that is over. So the first question we want to ask ourselves is why Reconstruction ends. What brings an end to this time period of reform in the South? If you look at these two political cartoons side by side, you might be surprised to note that they're actually drawn by the same person, Thomas Nast, who was a Northern cartoonist. The one on the left is a plea for enfranchisement for African American men, the right to vote, and the one on the right is lampooning the Southern governments under the leadership of African American politicians. Look at the way that Nast depicts the African American man on the left as compared to the much more cartoonish and almost animal-like depiction of African Americans on the left or the right. This kind of indicates to you that the mood shifts over time. Northern politicians were getting kind of worried about the cost of keeping troops in the South, which was necessary to suppress the activities of the Ku Klux Klan. There was a lot of corruption in the government, particularly in Grant's administration. Grant himself really was mostly above this sort of corruption, but there was a lot of corruption of the people within his government, and that kind of tainted Grant and really discredited some of his policies towards the South and other reforms that he was attempting to do. And in a lot of ways, people were kind of losing interest in it. This was a difficult task to do, to change the South, to suppress the racism, and people just kind of got tired of it. Once they started removing troops from the South, the Ku Klux Klan will return, and they will begin terrorizing African American voters all over again, trying to suppress their vote. In addition, politically, we have a group of white Democrats in the South who refer to themselves as redeemers because they were redeeming the South, at least in their eyes. And they worked to undermine the black Republicans in the South. They would highlight any corruption within the local governments and try to focus all the blame on the African American politicians, even though there was plenty of blame to go around. They also appealed to the working class farmers by pointing out how much their taxes were going up to pay for a lot of these reforms. And remember, the South didn't have a lot of public accommodations. They had poor roads, very few railroads, and almost no public schools to speak of before Reconstruction. And the building of all those things as part of the reforms of that era was going to be expensive. And the Redeemers are going to reach out to the moderate Republicans and start to pull them into their fold and sort of form a coalition of moderate to conservative whites as part of the Democratic Party in the South and attempts to reclaim or retake control of those Southern governments. If you had to pick a specific point in history when Reconstruction ended, it would be the Compromise of 1877 that resulted from the presidential election of 1876. The two men running for president were on the left, Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, and on the right, hometown hero Rutherford B. Hayes as the Republican. Now, when the election was held, it was pretty close, indicating kind of the shift politically going on in America back towards the middle, away from the more radical interventionist policies of the radical Republicans. And in the end, Tilden won the popular vote with about 51%. But as you may or may not know, the popular vote does not decide who the president is. The Electoral College does. And in the Electoral College, 3 of the states were in dispute. Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina were too close to call, and there was definitely some shenanigans going on by the Ku Klux Klan and other vote suppressors. Well, the people who got to count or do the recounts of those votes in those states were the Republican Party, and surprise, surprise, they awarded all 3 states to Hayes. Now, Hayes needed to win all 3 in order to become president. Tilden only needed 1. There was an outcry from the Democrats in Congress, so they put together a commission to look into it. That commission voted along party lines once again to award the election to Hayes. Democrats cried foul. They threatened to block his inauguration. There was even talk of armed militias marching on Washington, D.C. So the leadership of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party got together and hashed out this compromise, or what becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. And in it, the Democrats agreed to not block Hayes' inauguration as president, and Hayes would agree to remove the last of the federal troops from the South, and there was some stuff about, federal money going towards railroads and a few other minor details there. End result is Hayes becomes president in 1877. The last of the federal troops are removed from the South, officially bringing an end to Reconstruction, as well as any protection that African American voters may have had. So was Reconstruction a success? Well, it depends on which historians you ask and at what time they were writing. That varies from historian to historian and from time to time when they were writing it. You did see a lot of reforms being implemented during that time period, such as the addition of many, many public schools across the South, like seen in this picture here, as well as building up infrastructure like roads and railroads. The Freedmen's Bureau was quite successful at helping African Americans reunite with their families, as well as promoting literacy and education among them. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote to African American men, but as mentioned before, this causes a bit of a split within the reform movements, both promoting African American civil rights and women's rights, and even a split within the women's rights movement itself. There's a political shift happening as a result of this as well. Because of their support, the radical Republican support for Reconstruction, African Americans will become reliable voters for the Republican Party for quite some time, until well into the 20th century. The Democratic Party then gained a lot of support among Southern whites. Those moderate Republicans and the conservative Democrats kind of formed the basis of the party there. This establishes the federal government's authority over the state governments, as they dictated to those Southern states what requirements they had to meet to return to the Union and so forth. But ultimately, the voters opted to leave the South alone, a return to what was called home rule, which was to the detriment of the civil rights of African Americans there. Once Reconstruction had ended, Southern state governments began rolling back the reforms of that era and eroding the rights that African Americans had recently won. The so-called civil rights cases chipped away at some of the protections of the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled that states defined what a person's rights were that needed to be protected, and it also ruled that the 14th Amendment did not protect you from discrimination by an individual. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, was circumvented by convict labor. The men you see in this photograph here are convict laborers who've been loaned out from a prison to work on the railroad. Southern states passed what were called vagrancy laws, which essentially made it illegal for you to be out and about if you didn't have a job and could not prove you were looking for a job. Now, since they were no longer protected from personal discrimination, African American men were finding it more difficult to get employment, and police officers, of course, would specifically target black men when they found them. Once they were arrested and convicted, they would be sentenced to hard labor, working on the railroads, or sometimes even loaned out to work on private plantations, doing very much the same work that enslaved men had been doing prior to the Civil War. The 15th Amendment was subject to a series of laws that were designed to prevent blacks from voting. Poll taxes that were too high for many of the unemployed or underemployed African Americans to pay, literacy tests that people who had little to no formal education, as a formerly enslaved person probably did, found difficult to pass. Now, the problem for the Redeemers in the South who want to sort of unify the white vote is many whites in the South were too poor to pay a poll tax and illiterate and unable to pass a literacy test. So they would include things called grandfather clauses into these laws. And grandfather clauses basically said if your father or grandfather could vote before a certain date, usually 1865, you were exempt from paying the poll tax or having to pass the literacy test. You were grandfathered in. Well, of course, the only people whose fathers and grandfathers could vote before that time period were white men. In addition, both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, discriminated against African Americans in holding their primaries. Primaries are the elections parties hold to decide who will be their candidate to run in the general election. And since African Americans were shut out from these primaries, when it came time to vote for their representatives to the state governments or Congress, many African American men found that only white men were their options. Once the Redeemers had been able to regain control of the southern state governments through intimidation by the Ku Klux Klan and voter suppression through the new voting requirements, they began passing more laws to further restrict the rights of African Americans. These are the infamous Jim Crow segregation laws, which required separation of the races in all public facilities, be they parks, bathrooms, public pools, restaurants, rail cars, schools, and so forth. A man named Homer Plessy challenged these segregation laws when he was removed from a rail car that was reserved for whites only. And his case made it all the way to the Supreme Court in 1896. And the court ruled that segregation laws were not a violation of the 14th Amendment so long as the separate facilities were equal. Now, as you can imagine, the separate facilities were never equal. Those that were set aside for African Americans were almost always inferior. And Plessy v. Ferguson ruling will lead to an explosion of these segregation laws, not just in the old Confederacy, but throughout much of the country, in the Southwest in particular. For example, many of these signs on this slide are actually from California's segregation laws. African Americans will continue to push and fight for civil rights throughout the late 19th and well into the 20th century. Although the leaders in this movement often disagreed as to exactly how they should achieve that goal. In the upper left-hand corner, we see Booker T. Washington, one of these leaders. Washington argued that segregation laws were basically going to be the law of the land for the time being, and that African Americans should focus on vocational training, and as such, he was one of the founders of the Tuskegee Institute, and also on the economic development of their own communities. And by proving themselves to be honest, hardworking citizens, eventually white society would be forced to give them the respect and equal treatment that they deserved. In the upper right is W.E.B. Du Bois, and he very stringently disagreed with Washington. Du Bois said that equality and equal treatment were due to the African Americans. They had them by right, and they must demand them immediately. And usually through the NAACP, he continued to fight these laws in court. Now, the determined-looking young lady in the middle there is Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a journalist from the South who wrote in the North, and she attempted to highlight through her articles and pamphlets the lynchings that were becoming more and more common in the South. Now, the way a lynching typically went would be an African-American man would be accused of a crime, which he usually had not committed, and before he could go to trial, a white mob would come to his jail cell, take him out, torture, and execute him. Now, this was not in any sort of attempt to create justice, but as a way of sort of reinforcing what had now become the racial caste system in the South. The graphic organizer for this lesson includes 4 terms across the top that are all things that led to the end of Reconstruction, and 4 across the bottom that are all things that led to the institutionalization of racism, in other words, legal discrimination. Your job is to explain how. So, for example, the civil rights cases chipped away at the 14th Amendment of individuals. Good luck. Te amo. Adios.